Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Ichigo and his sisters raised by Urahara after his parents died, part 1. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the DRACOQUEEN22 for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. Let's start this video. Ichigo. He heard his mother call his name behind him, even above the sound of the rushing waters of the river. Ichigo didn't stop, his concern for the little girl overriding his usual instinct to listen to her. He reached, trying to stop her from falling, but she vanished before his eyes. He was left straining for nothing, grasping at empty air and seeing the splashing river right in front of him. Ichigo slipped, shoes slick against stone and grass, falling forward. He could feel the rain beating against his back and on his head, it was so loud. Confusion attacked his young mind. Where had she gone? And then, he slipped. A hand grabbed him, his mother's voice just behind. She pulled, yanking him away from the raging waters. Ichigo let out a startled squeak and stumbled against her. She tripped on something, he wasn't sure what, and the two of them went tumbling down. There was something in the air, a heaviness. It stole his breath. Ichigo gasped as he hit the ground, a weight falling on top of him. He could feel his mother's warm arms wrapped around him, enclosing and safe. "She's disappeared," he exclaimed in his surprise, still looking to where the little girl had been. She had seemed so sad and lonely, like she needed help. "She's not here, Ka-chan." His mother didn't move. He could feel her weight in her warmth. Ichigo knew she was there, but she didn't speak. She didn't move at all. Ichigo shivered, feeling rain splash on his face and soak into his clothes. It was so wet. "Ka-chan," he murmured again. Tentative. Suddenly frightened as something inside of him screamed. That feeling of pressure rose again, making him gasp. It felt as though something was trying to squash him down. He'd felt this before, he was sure. It was the same sensation when he saw those monsters, but never this close before. Like one of those ugly things stood right next to him. Rain trickled down his face, and he could see the soft brown of his mother's hair right next to him. A smell, sharp and metal-like, rose in the air. Even above the scent of the rain and his mom's favorite perfume. Ichigo whimpered, unable to help the fear that grabbed him. "Ka-chan?" She didn't answer. She didn't move at all. Ichigo crawled out from beneath his mother and grabbed her shoulder, shaking her briefly. She didn't respond, and he struggled to turn her over, trying to see her face. Blood was everywhere, so bright in the dimness of the storm-clouded day. Everything blurred red, swimming in surging tears. His hand, cold already, patted her cheek where a few specks dotted brightly. Her eyes were closed, and she didn't move. So very still. Just like the old lady from across the street had been when they went to her funeral last year. His hand clenched on his mother's shoulder tightly, his breath hitching painfully. "Ka-chan." Behind him, or maybe above him or even both, there was a sudden burst of strange laughter. It was raspy and rough, like the old man with really bad breathing problems in his dad's clinic. Ichigo looked up and found one of those scary creatures hovering over him. Its body was covered in shaggy hair, and the bone white of its face was even more frightening this close. The tongue emerged from its mouth, slurping over dangerous-looking teeth. Ichigo gaped. And didn't even see the attack coming. Something whipped towards him, slamming into his chest. His body went flying several feet backwards, and he crashed into the ground, rolling several times before coming to a stop. Ichigo coughed, little body racked with pain as he tasted blood. He had bitten his lip. Slowly, Ichigo tried to get a hold of himself, paralyzed by a gripping fear. His hand slammed into the slick grass, attempting to push himself up. It was hard to breathe though, and as he shifted, he heard a strange clank. Looking down, Ichigo saw that there was something metal hanging from his chest. Dropping back to his knees, he touched it with trembling fingers. Smooth and cold. It was a really thick chain, and it was attached to him. It clanked loudly as he moved. Really scared, he noticed that it led somewhere, and he followed the path with his eyes. It twisted across the ground, leading right back to where his mother was still lying. And he saw himself there with her on the other end of the chain. Why? What was going on? He didn't understand. The monster, it was still there, too. It hunched over like a dog preparing to pounce. It was looking right at something, and Ichigo realized that his dad was standing there between the monster and his mother. He was wearing strange black clothes, white fluttering over one of his shoulders. And he didn't look like the happy, goofy man that Ichigo knew, but something more serious and just a bit scary. That feeling of being pushed down grew stronger, and Ichigo struggled to keep from falling back into the mud. His dad held something shiny, pointing it towards the creature. It was a sword, like in all the anime he watched or the manga his mom read to him. Just like the heroes. His dad was protecting them, Ichigo thought. Then, Ichigo needed to do his part too. He needed to protect his mother. He had said he was going to. That he was going to be strong enough to protect his mother. And his little sisters. And everyone he could. Resolve gathered, he attempted to crawl forward despite feeling so tired. He didn't understand why it was so hard for him to move or why he couldn't seem to breathe either. The chains clanked as he went and he worried the monster would look, but it was too busy fighting his dad. It made a horrible noise as his dad hit it with his sword. And there was a terrible sound every time the blade scratched across its claws. His dad grunted and cursed, going so fast that Ichigo didn't even see him move at all. Slapping his hand against the ground, Ichigo pulled himself forward. It was so dark and dim, but he could see other things starkly. The red of blood. The orange-brown of his mother's hair. The pink of her sweater. The fallen umbrella. The clash of sword and claw. And fear covered everything. The monster laughed that grating old man laugh. There was a wet thud, accompanying a loud sound. Audible even above the rushing river and falling rain, which was growing heavier and heavier, but it still couldn't wash away the blood. Something scraped and slid through water and mud. Ichigo stared in horror as his dad hit the ground and bounced a few times before not moving, water splashing up around him. Seconds later, his sword smacked into the grass in several pieces, far away from the outstretched hand of his father. His dad groaned, tipping his head to look at him. His lips moved and blood slipped from his mouth. Ichigo. His hand slid out from under him and Ichigo fell forward, getting a mouthful of mud and rainwater. The weight of the chain kept dragging him down and it didn't help that something else was pushing him towards the ground. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore and it was harder to concentrate. Du-chan. Heh, heh. The monster cackled, seeming not to notice the blood that streamed down its eyes. Quite the feast. Ichigo's eyes widened in fear. He didn't know that those things could talk. Shivering, he tried to move, to back away from it. But he couldn't. His body didn't want to obey, paralyzed by fear. Tears streamed down his face, but it was impossible to tell in the rain. He could see his dad and his mom, just there. He could reach them if he just tried. With a loud groan, Ichigo's father tried to get up. He slapped his palm onto the grass, forced himself onto his forearms, but he didn't manage anything higher. Before Ichigo could blink, a massive claw came down, slamming against his back. The ground cracked as his father was crushed beneath. His dad coughed up a lot of blood as Ichigo heard a wet crack. The monster laughed again, and just like his mother, his father didn't move either. He could barely see his dad in the crater that the creature had made. Ichigo whimpered, his entire body going colder and colder. Something slammed into him from the side, batting him across the ground. He went skidding over grass and mud, but the length of the chain was no longer with him. Ichigo felt his arm give an uncomfortable crack and he cried out in pain, black dots dancing in front of his eyes. No matter how much he tried, he couldn't move his arm. There was a terrible rending feeling. And his chest felt as if someone had punched it. He sucked in a sobbing breath, choking on his own cries and peeled open his eyes. That thick chain, that strong metal. It had snapped like a twig. He wasn't connected anymore, Ichigo realized with a growing sense of fear. And somehow, he just knew that fact was important. He wasn't connected anymore. He was going to die, just like his mom and dad. Ichigo had that sudden revelation. The monster had killed his parents, and it was going to get him, too. The creature turned towards him, licking its mouth again. There was blood on its claws. It licked that, too. And Ichigo cried out in terror. Clack clack. With a loud sucking sound and a strange tapping, Ichigo heard someone coming closer. He forced himself to look, though he didn't want to. Instead of another monster, however, it was a man wearing an ugly striped hat and a pair of jeta. He carried a cane in one hand, and a black butterfly hovered on one of his fingers. Despite his fear, Ichigo thought for a moment that it was a rather beautiful thing. As the stranger approached, the monster seemed to sense something. It whirled to face the newcomer, snarling angrily. One claw lashed out at the Jetabashi, but he shifted to the side, easily dodging. The butterfly took off from his finger, black wings flapping strongly despite the pounding rain. Ichigo watched as the man easily sidestepped another attack and calmly drew a sword out of his cane. The stranger said something, but Ichigo couldn't make it out above everything else. The sense of power grew strong in the air, filling around him on both sides. He tried to move forward, but his broken arm didn't want to obey him. It hurt so badly. And he could hardly breathe. Ichigo reached out with his good hand, trying to get to his mother. It was too far. She wasn't moving, and neither was his dad. There was so much blood, despite the rain. And the remnants of the chain attached to his chest rattled and clanked. The remaining weight of it was beginning to be painful, tugging on his chest and making him feel hollow. Ichigo heard clacking teeth, strangely close to him. And then, it felt as if something were gnawing over his entire body. He tried to cry out, but his breath was stolen from him, his body curling inwards. The chain was making a strange, horrible sound. And it hurt so badly, more tears squeezed from his eyes. Darkness beckoned to him, promising that it wouldn't hurt anymore if he just gave in. And somewhere in it, he heard a grating laughter, and there was a brief image of golden eyes, swallowed by black. It was harder for Ichigo to stay awake. He was cold and hurting, heart aching just from the sight of his mother. He collapsed against the mud and grass, shivering pitifully. He couldn't see anything, but her hair spread out like a halo. It was becoming dirtier and dirtier with each passing second. The scream pierced the sky, but Ichigo didn't even have the strength to jump. His heart pounded in his chest with fear, though he couldn't understand how that was still possible. He felt a strange weight lifting from his back, but he still couldn't move. He didn't even bother to try. The sound of footsteps squishing through the mud and grass floated to his ears. He forced his eyes open, catching sight of those Jetta approaching. And then, the strange man, his hat missing, was coming closer. The crouched gray-green eyes seeming so kind for all their sadness. Shiny and bright with moisture. A hand reached out, settling gently on Ichigo's hair. "I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner," the man whispered quietly. His hand was so warm, voice gentle. Ichigo sniffled loudly, his outstretched fingers clutching at empty air. He wanted to feel safe, but all he could think of was that monster's cutting claws. All he could see when he closed his eyes were blotches of bright blood. That thing was cackling again, the thing that was inside of him, but wasn't. His chest hurt, the remaining chain tugging on him as if it were alive. It was too much for him. The cold and the wet and the attack and the little girl who had vanished into nothing. The hungry coils and the dark eyes gleaming maliciously at him. A pale hand capped with black nails, reaching and reaching. The last thing he remembered before he slipped into darkness was that stranger's warm touch, a comforting trickle of power tickling across his skin. And fingers sliding through his hair and chasing away the fear. "Ichinai. Wake up or you're going to be late. Asano-kun's already waiting for you." With a groan, Ichigo rolled over in his bed, Yuzu's voice prodding him out of his doze. He had woken at the sound of his alarm, but had wanted a few more precious moments of sleep. Staying up late the night before to study and taking out that pesky hollow along the way left him feeling exhausted. "Ichinai." Fists hit his door loudly, no doubt Karen's handiwork. "Karen?" Yuzu chastised, her voice audible even on the other side of the door. "You shouldn't hit it so hard." "I'm getting up." He called back loudly before Karen came storming in and gave him a wake-up kick as she was sometimes fond of doing. He didn't know why she had turned out so violent. They were his younger sisters. Wasn't he supposed to be doing the protecting and looking after? Instead, it was the other way around. Yuzu enjoyed playing the mother, especially when she dragged Urahara into helping her. Dad thought it was amusing and encouraged her, calling Yuzu his precious little helper. Even though it was really Tessai-san who did most of the housework and cooking. Grumbling under his breath, Ichigo hauled himself out of bed, biting back on another yawn. One hand idly scratched at his bare stomach as he stumbled across the floor to his closet. Regrettably, there was no time for a shower today. He'd have to make do with a quick rinse after gym or something. Ichigo threw a hand over his hair as he fumbled through his preparations for the day, still feeling the effects of accrued fatigue. He shoved the remnants of his homework into his school bag as he pulled socks over his feet and stumbled into a pair of pants. Wearing a uniform for school was such a pain, but one he'd learned to deal with. It wasn't going to change anytime soon. Throughout the house, he could hear the familiar noises of the day starting, even as he searched for a clean undershirt. The floor was rumbling faintly, one of his dad's experiments probably approaching critical mass again. No doubt Yuzu was putting the finishing touches on their bento, as Tessai-san whipped up breakfast for all of them next to her. He could hear Karen arguing with Jinta over who got to use the bathroom next, while Urahara beat them all by sliding inside first. And Dad was certainly overseeing this all as he perched at the breakfast table and peered blearily into a cup of tea that was brewed by Tessai and not himself. Everyone knew that Dad's tea could clean up a paint spill. It was that toxic. He would be missing his usual ugly hat, but only until he realized it wasn't on his head. Then, there would be a frantic search for the horrid accessory, which would likely continue until right before all the kids headed out the door to school. When they arrived home later that day, it would be back in its proper position, perched on top of his head. Really, every day was pretty much the same. Fighting back a yawn, Ichigo snatched the one thing he could never do without off his desk and slipped it into his pocket. There was a clink as it knocked into his cell phone, desperately in need of charging. He rarely used the damn thing and only carried it because Yuzu and Urahara worried. Ichigo couldn't argue because he understood. His little sister had lost her parents in a single moment and very nearly lost him as well. That she would have nightmares of the rest of her family disappearing in the blink of an eye was understandable. Ichigo sympathized. There was a thump down the hall as Karen knocked Jinta out of the way again and like always Anne rushed into the bathroom after Urahara meekly popped out. Unlike the others, Urahara and Jinta were schooled at home and taught by Tessai, but that didn't stop them from joining the morning rush for readiness. Ichigo understood why they couldn't exactly attend regular school. It would be hard to explain their existence to the officials when they weren't on any registry. Not to mention the fact that they didn't seem to age. It came from being not exactly human. And again, Ichigo wasn't entirely sure what to call himself. As he slid into his button-up school shirt, he noticed the scar on his arm. Wide and nearly faded after the years but still present. It would never vanish completely, just like the memories. Always serving to remind him of that one precise moment where everything had changed. When he had lost his birth parents, his mother and Issen, and his consummate humanity all in one fell stroke. Finishing the last button, Ichigo grabbed his bag and slung it over his shoulder. He opened his door just in time to prevent Urahara from knocking gently on it, reminding him again that Kigo was waiting. Even after Ichigo had moved, Kigo and Mizuru still came to his house first, despite the fact that it was out of the way. He didn't quite get it. Ichigo gently patted the quiet girl on the head. "Thanks, Urahara." "I know," he assured her as he shifted the weight of his book bag on his back. "See you later. Have fun at school." She beamed up at him, even as she lifted hands to quickly smooth her hair back into place. Ichigo merely nodded and continued down the hall, nearly walking into utter madness. Sure enough, his father was at the table, watching his tea steam and yawning widely. He always woke to join them for breakfast, even if he immediately took a nap afterwards. Dad claimed that morning time was family time and left it at that. At the moment, he was not only missing his hat, but his usual Haori as well. Tessai was in the process of setting plates out on the table as Karen and Jinta tumbled into the kitchen just behind Ichigo, pushing by him. "Morning," Ichigo said generally as he twisted to avoid them. "Eat something, Ichi-nai," Yuzu replied back, deftly tying the bows over the bento. She had quickly adapted into this role, even if it wasn't necessary. Ichigo suspected it was her way of coping, taking care of her family in their mother's place. "Don't have time," Ichigo responded and perfectly timed his steps to grab a piece of toast as it popped out of the toaster. "Gotta go." He shoved a quarter of the bread into his mouth, forgoing his usual layer of butter as he headed to the door. Kigo tended to get antsy the longer he waited, and that was never fun to deal with. Yuzu hurried to catch up to him, even as their father yawned loudly. "Out late again?" he called after Ichigo, idly flipping a page of his paper and finally reaching for his cup. He looked tired and must have been up late himself, working on his most recent and strange invention. "Something like that," Ichigo returned, pausing at the door to slide his feet into his shoes. Yuzu chose that moment to thrust his bento at him, grinning brightly. "I made your favorite today," she informed him as Ichigo accepted the box and carefully stowed it in his bag. Ichigo smiled softly at his sister. "Thanks. You should hurry, too. You guys shouldn't be late either." "Don't worry, we won't," Karen shouted from the kitchen, words a bit muffled due to the breakfast she was shoveling in at a breakneck speed. "Bye, Ichi-nai." After another round of farewells, Ichigo was finally free to pull open the door and step out into the cool morning. No doubt the day would warm up quickly, however. He wasn't worried about catching a cold. And sure enough, both Kigo and Mizuru were waiting for him just past the stoop, the former crouching down and poking disinterestedly at a lone stalk of grass. "Ah, my hat," was the last thing Ichigo heard before the door closed behind him. He shook his head and wondered why he hadn't completely lost his sanity at this point. Guo. A simple dodge was all it took to avoid Kigo's overly enthusiastic greeting. He walked right by the other teen's twitching form as he tripped over his own legs and crashed to the ground. His bag launched into the air, only to land directly on his head. Kigo groaned. "Morning, Mizuru," Ichigo mumbled around his mouthful of toast, dropping some breadcrumbs to the ground. It crunched as he took another bite. "Good morning, Ichigo," Kigo's better half returned, idly munching on his own breakfast. This morning it was one of those fruit and granola cereal bars that Ichigo thought were pretty disgusting. "Did you finish that assignment?" Ichigo scowled, thinking none too happily of the pages of vocabulary he'd forced himself to do before crashing last night. Imagine vocabulary at his age. It was ridiculous. "Yeah," he replied, idly scratching a hand over his arm. "Aren't we too old for that stuff?" "Totally," Kigo interjected, leaping to his feet as though he hadn't been rejected and springing up on Ichigo's other side. "That's why I didn't do it. Ha ha." He continued to babble, but Ichigo only half listened. He'd learned long ago that it was safer for his sanity if he only paid attention to Kigo every once in a while. The other teen had a habit of going off on long, unrelated tangents. Or spouting nonsense about the next busty female to walk into a room. He really was a strange kid. Nothing truly out of the ordinary occurred on the walk to school. He thought he saw a flutter of black wings, perhaps. But Ichigo was quickly distracted by the brief shiver of negative and the distant roar of a hollow. It was beyond his capacity to assist at the moment, however. No doubt by the time he arrived, the resident Shinigami would have already dispatched it. Even so, he'd kept his senses locked on the beast until he was certain it had been cleansed. He'd seen the Shinigami before, enough to know that she was a woman, but that was about it. He'd made it a point not to cross paths with her, since his existence would be rather difficult to explain. And he didn't want his dad to be found either or for something to happen to Urahara and Jinta. So Ichigo purposefully avoided the woman's vicinity. It was better that way. And he'd learned to be careful that she didn't track him down either. He was sure that she was aware someone else was out there destroying hollows. Ishida was guilty of that too, but so long as she didn't trace it all to him, it was good. Despite his late morning, they made it to the school on time for homeroom, saving all three from being counted as tardy. Ichigo launched himself at Chad, the tall, half-Mexican, enduring the aggressive embrace with the same patience in which he endured everything else. He tipped his head at Ichigo, who returned the gesture. And then, Chad shifted to pry Ichigo's stupid self off and tell Mizuru that he'd done the homework, too. Continuing further in, Ichigo greeted Totsuki with a wave and received one in return. She was too busy to talk, however, in the midst of drop-kicking Chizuru away from Inoue again. It was like some sort of comedy act the three of them couldn't resist performing each day. For Ichigo, it was normal. It was something he came to expect, just like Yuzu's bento and Kigo's outrageous greetings. It was the familiarity of every day, something that helped ground him when his mind sought to remind him of that rainy afternoon 6 years ago. Your efforts at punctuality are meager at best as always, Kurosaki. And that cold and formal tone would be none other than Ishida. Dropping his bag down beside his desk, Ichigo slid into his seat and tossed the arrogant Quincy an annoyed scowl. Good morning to you, too, he grumbled in return, not quite up for his usual spar and banter with the other boy. Ishida reached up with a slim finger, sliding his glasses further up his nose so that the light made the lenses gleam menacingly. He really liked doing that. Maybe he thought it was intimidating or something. Like I would waste my breath on greeting a Shinigami, Quincy muttered under his breath with a distinct sniff. He folded his book closed with a quiet sound, stashing it away in his desk. At the front of the room, their teacher strode in with a half-harried look as usual. The bell chose that moment to ring, causing the other students to hurry back to their desks, preparing to suffer another day of higher learning. Ichigo rolled his eyes, leaning down to grab one of the notebooks from his bag and snapping it onto his desk. He and Ishida were reluctant acquaintances at best. They weren't exactly friends, but they weren't exactly enemies either. It had all started when the bespectacled boy had wandered up to Ichigo years ago and said simply, "I know what you are." At the time, Ichigo himself had barely understood what happened to him. His dad had tried to explain, but it was hard for his 9-year-old grief-stricken mind to grasp. Ishida had put it in simpler terms. He'd also spent the next several hours telling Ichigo about what it meant to be a Quincy and how important it was. Going on and on about how much he hated Shinigami and why blah blah blah. It lasted long enough that Ichigo had just yelled at him about not caring because none of the past mattered to him. He hadn't been there. It wasn't his fault and he didn't have anything to do with it. He shouldn't have to bear the burden or responsibility of something he couldn't have helped. Ever since then, they were reluctant friends of a sort. At any rate, they kept each other's secrets. Ishida was the only one outside of his family who knew what Ichigo really was. What he did at night and the abilities he carried. He was also the only one who knew the truth about what had happened to Ichigo's parents. It was an unspoken yet cherished bond. And Ichigo would stab his eye out with Zangetsu before he would admit that aloud. Alright, pipe down, Achi-sensei demanded at the front of the class, waving one hand to get their attention. Got some announcements for you guys. There was a chorus of groans throughout the room, though the class obediently settled. The morning hustle and bustle quieted, leaving plenty of room for Achi-sensei to start speaking. It didn't seem important to Ichigo, so he turned her out and propped his head on the desk. He held a pen in one hand, just in case, and waited for something noteworthy to catch his attention. But his eyes were drawn to the window, the sky outside a dull gray. It looked like it was going to rain later. And he hadn't brought an umbrella. Ichigo really hated the rain. It made him remember. There was a shudder, and then, the entire rock exploded into bits, sending a heavy cloud of dust and debris into the air. Ichigo painted, letting the tip of his rest against the ground as he wiped at a bead of sweat on his brow. That boulder was pretty well decimated at this point. He was getting a bit tired of training against rocks though. He wondered if he could convince his dad to spar with him a bit. Or maybe Uruchi-san would swing by for a visit and he could bribe her into doing it. Sometimes, she was willing to break her retirement to go a few rounds with him. Though if he wasn't careful, Tessai-san would get wind of his boredom and start teaching the higher levels of again. And Ichigo wasn't that bored. A spark of hunger burst to life in his stomach and Ichigo straightened. It was probably time he headed upstairs anyway. As he dissolved his, sliding Zangetsu back into his sheath, Ichigo flitted towards the massive ladder. It had surprised him the first time he'd been shown the huge underground space beneath the dot. Now, it was just commonplace to him. His father was really strange. A burst of later and Ichigo was climbing out of the basement, Shihakusho clinging to him stickily. He realized that he would need a bath, even as he pondered if Yuzu and Karen had gotten home yet. A quick scan of the present answered that question for him, they hadn't. Faintly golden eyes flickered to the clock on the wall, and Ichigo frowned. It was pretty late. Later than he thought it was. After dark. They were usually home by now. Rolling one shoulder, which was stiff from swinging Zangetsu's weight for the last couple of hours, Ichigo padded down the hall. Above him, he could hear the sound of the sky rumbling. The storm from earlier threatened to pour down again. He hoped his sisters came home soon, he didn't want them caught in it. Ahead of him, Tessai-san emerged from one of the storage rooms, poring over a supply book, but looking up as Ichigo approached. "Are you injured, Ichigo?" he asked, noticing that the teen was now massaging the sore shoulder. Ichigo shook his head. "Nothing a warm shower won't fix. You haven't heard from Yuzu or Karen?" Tessai-san tapped the end of the pen against his chin as he considered. Yuzu mentioned something about going to the park after school. I think Karen went with her. No doubt to protect their sweetly naive sibling. Ichigo nodded in thanks and continued down the corridor, heading to his room where he would reclaim his body from the temporary soul. He hadn't gotten but a few steps when the edge of his senses rattled with a distinct sensation of hollow. And it was close. A bad feeling, not unlike dread, settled in Ichigo's stomach. The possibility that the hollow was after his sisters was slim but not improbable. Karen could see them, which was a plus. But Yuzu only had vague feelings. And neither of them had any way to protect themselves from the hungry creatures. Ichigo knew that he couldn't just let this one slide. Not that he planned on doing so anyway. Worried, he hurried from his house and quickly leapt up to the nearest rooftop. It would be the quickest way to cross the city. The sky was dark above him, both with the threat of an oncoming storm and the just descended nightfall. As he flitted across Karakura, the sense of apprehension grew thicker until he felt his pulse race. Ichigo trusted his instincts. He was certain they were in danger. A curse fell from his lips as he put in an extra burst of speed, even if it tired him out. He'd already lost his first parents, he was not going to lose his sister as well. Ichigo had promised to protect them. He would not break that vow. Within seconds, the park was in sight. Ichigo wasted no time in drawing Zangetsu, calling to the forefront of his mind the easiest to throw. A sharp leap took him down to ground level with him crashing through a few tree branches before hitting dirt. The soil squished beneath his dot and then, he darted forward, able to feel his sisters now. Karen especially. She was angry and scared. But there was another presence. That Shinigami. The one who was supposed to patrol Karakura. And she was doing her job for once. Though he supposed he couldn't blame her if taking care of all the hollows in Karakura, an unusual number as his dad had explained, was a bit difficult for one person. If she were fighting that hollow, then everything was going to be fine. But just in case. Just in case, he would check out the situation. Ichigo burst out from under the trees just as a hollow's roar echoed through the air, making a chill race up his spine. He gawked at the sight of the huge creature. It wasn't the first of its kind that he had seen, but it was definitely bigger than normal. A huge hollow. Maybe even close to Mino's level. With claws already stained by blood and a massive mouth that was capable of swallowing him whole. He'd seen its kind before. Not that smart but definitely a nuisance. His fingers tightened around Zangetsu as he searched for his sisters, finally finding them huddled together near a bench. Karen was throwing rocks at the hollow, while Yuzu was cradling her head with blood streaming from a cut. Anger immediately struck Ichigo, and he moved without thinking, bursting into the clearing with his Zanpakuto raised. Hadu no Sanju Ichi, Shakahu. A burst of flame splattered against the side of the hollow, burning its chalky white skin. The hollow roared in agony and swung out with one meaty arm, smacking claws against the slim form of the Shinigami. The black-clad woman went flying backwards and snapped harshly against a tree. Her head struck with a solid thunk and she slid down the trunk, blood dripping from multiple wounds. "Ichinai," Karen called out, noticing her brother's presence. She waved frantically in his direction. "Help her." "You don't have to tell me that," he shouted back, already running to put himself between the hollow and his sisters. Not that it was necessary. The second the breadth of his filled the clearing, the hollow turned its entire focus to him. A long tongue licked its massive teeth hungrily, and it growled low in its throat. Disgust crawled over Ichigo's body, mind helpfully recalling the gravelly, mocking voice of the hollow that had killed his mother and Issen. The gleam of hunger in that creature's eyes matched the one before him. Clenching his teeth to shake away the past, Ichigo lifted Zangetsu and charged. He leaped into the air to avoid a harsh swipe of its claw, the sharpened talon whistling as it cleaved empty space. The hollow roared in aggravation as Ichigo rose above it, the tip of his blade already gleaming black and red. It had tried to eat his sisters. It made Yuzu cry and bleed and made that look of fear enter Karen's eyes, even after she had vowed to become strong. He didn't want to waste time playing with this monster. He wanted it defeated. He wanted it dead. It spiked around him, eyes gleaming a stark silver as he drew on Zangetsu's power. Jitsuga with a fierce swing, a harsh array of poured from his Zanpakuto, careening towards the hollow. The creature cried out, its roar rattling the ground as it batted futilely towards Ichigo. There was a second where the attack seemed to envelop its body in tendrils of red and black before the entire world shuddered and the hollow dissolved under the force of Ichigo's dot within seconds. Nothing remained but the faint aftertaste of fear and regret. And hunger, always hunger. Panting a little, his shoulder twinging at the harsh swing, Ichigo landed softly on his feet. He grimaced as he sheathed Zangetsu, rubbing fingers over the aching muscle. His arm had never quite been the same after the grand fissure as his dad had named that hollow nearly ripped it from the socket. It hurts at the oddest times, like now for instance. Two forms suddenly slammed into him from behind, arms wrapped solidly around his waist. "Ichinai!" His sisters cried out in tandem. Yuzu pressed her face to his side, even as Karen looked up at him, determination battling with the fright that had struck her. "You guys okay?" Ichigo kneeled to hug them tighter. His precious family, his dear sisters. And so close to losing them to another hollow. Karen seemed fine, if a little dirtied. But Yuzu's forehead was still bleeding. Ichigo frowned, looking intently at the wound as his free hand searched for a handkerchief. He usually carried something for the occasional injuries he suffered. He carefully dabbed at the cut and was relieved to find that it was smaller than it initially appeared. Head wounds really did bleed more than others. Yuzu sniffled loudly and rubbed at her eyes, trying to show the same strength as her twin. "She saved us," the girl explained, gesturing towards the Shinigami, who hadn't moved. "I didn't know that thing would show up," Karen added with anger filling her tone. Not at the creature, however, but with herself. "I couldn't do anything." Her hands curled into small fists at her side, trembling from the force of her emotions. Sighing, Ichigo left the handkerchief in Yuzu's care, his sister wisely keeping it pressed to the injury. Tessai-san would have to heal it later. Ichigo would attempt it himself, but he didn't trust his abilities for something that delicate. He hadn't taken to his lessons in healing as well as those in swordsmanship and combat. "Dad's sure you'll get powers soon, Karen," he assured his little sister, slowly rising to his feet. He patted her head, despite the annoyed look she tossed him. "Don't rush into it." Her hands lifted, clamping down on her hat to keep it from shifting around. I know. That's not the point." Her frown deepened. "If I had my own powers, I could protect myself and Yuzu." Didn't that sound familiar? Sometimes, Ichigo worried that he was having too much of an influence on her. He was the elder brother. It was supposed to be he who protected them. Yet, oftentimes, he felt it really was the other way around. "You have to help her," Yuzu interjected, lower lip trembling as she pressed the cloth to her forehead. "Shinigami-san protected us. She was hurt for our sake." Breaking a hand through his hair, Ichigo resisted the urge to sigh. He really didn't need to make contact with a woman, but Yuzu was right. If she was still alive, then Ichigo couldn't just leave her to lay there and die. He owed her. Yeah, he muttered and moved towards the spot where the Shinigami had fallen. As he approached, he noticed that she was still breathing. She was injured, but nothing seemed to be life-threatening. A few deep slices here and there, blood soaking both the ground and her shihakusho. But she was a Shinigami, it wasn't quite enough to kill her. No doubt it was pretty damn painful though. Ichigo crouched, shifting a bit so that the gray sunlight could fall on her face. For the first time, he was able to see the woman up close, and damn but she was a tiny thing. Barely bigger than his sisters. Maybe not even that. And she fought hollows. She seemed far too delicate for this type of work with her pale skin and slender frame. It was like imagining Yuzu wielding Zangetsu on the battlefield. "Hey," he grunted, reaching down to gently tap the unconscious female on the cheek. "Are you still alive?" She groaned, body twitching. One outstretched hand reached for her Zanpakuto, just beyond her fingertips. Her eyelids fluttered, and then, dark blue eyes were attempting to focus. It was obvious she was having some difficulty. She sucked in a shuddery breath, startled at the sight of him. "Hey, and don't know," the girl murmured weakly. But her eyes closed again, twitching fingers falling abruptly still. Who the fuck was Kain? But Ichigo tossed the thought aside. It wasn't important. She was obviously hallucinating due to the attack. Ichigo twisted his jaw. "Hey. You. Don't die here," he growled in annoyance, giving her shoulder a shake. It was almost scary how tiny she was. She didn't wake again, however, no matter how much he shook her. And another poke to the cheek did nothing. The smell of blood in the air was now rather pungent. Though he could clearly see her chest rise and fall, it was obvious that medical attention was a necessity. She wouldn't wake again without it. Shit. This was really not what he needed right now. Rising to his feet with a heavy sigh, Ichigo reached down and picked up the woman. Well, girl really. It was what she resembled more. In one smooth motion, he had the unconscious Shinigami slung over his shoulder. She barely weighed more than one of his sisters, so it was an easy enough task. He tried not to think about the blood that was probably going to seep into his shakusho. Oh well, he needed a bath anyway. Is she going to die? Yuzu asked worriedly, twisting the red-stained cloth in her hands. Her large eyes shimmered with oncoming tears, ever concerned towards others. Judging by the rattle of breath against his back, Ichigo didn't think so. Not if I can help it, he answered because he honestly couldn't tell Yuzu no. Those damn wobbly eyes were like secret weapons. No matter what she asked, he couldn't deny her. He had no choice but to take the injured Shinigami back to the dot. He couldn't just let her die. And his conscience couldn't justify leaving her, hoping that her fellows would find her in time. Their father wouldn't be overly thrilled, but he'd help. Ichigo could only hope that she wouldn't ask too many questions. Or even better, they could heal her, toss her out, and never have to explain anything. Ichigo scooped up the girdles and slid it into the sheath for her. It would be easier to carry that way. Especially since he was going to grab Karen and Yuzu, too. After what happened, he'll be damned if he was going to leave the two of them to find their own way home. So he reached down and tossed Karen over his other shoulder. She protested loudly but settled down once he had her situated. Not leaving you here, he explained succinctly and reached for Yuzu, tucking her under his arm. The other he saved for steadying the unconscious girl. Above him, the sky rumbled once more before deciding it was tired of simply threatening. With a sharp burst of lightning, careening across the clouds, they opened up, spilling rain down onto the hapless group of four. And every one of them without an umbrella. Ichigo groaned. He'd have to hurry. He couldn't have his sisters get sick. And he doubted the rain would help the Shinigami either. He flinched as the cold water dropped onto his head, immediately slicking down his hair and slithering down the back of his shakusho. A preemptive shower. You're overprotective, Karen grumbled, tipping her head to the side and knocking into his own. But she held on anyway, her fingers tightly wrapped into his shakusho. Now hurry up. It's raining. Ichigo, however, didn't bristle at the comment. It might have been a tad bit true. But he'd already lost so much, he wasn't about to lose his precious sisters, too. Rolling his eyes, Ichigo checked that his burdens were secured and then shifted into dot. It was much faster than running, and by now, his sisters were used to it. And then, they were on their way home. Sliding the towel over his head, Ichigo slipped out of the bathroom and fought back a yawn. Above him, the rain was steadily falling, an annoying cadence on the rooftop. It hadn't let up at all in the past few hours, growing stronger and stronger. The sky rumbled loudly, inspiring another flash of lightning that was just visible beyond the window. He hoped no hollows were about tonight. It would be a bitch to fight in this mess. Ichigo let the towel slide down around his shoulders and turned down the hall, bare feet padding quietly across the wooden floor. It was unnaturally still in the house at the moment. Yuzu and Karen were most likely studying, and Jinta was helping Tessai-san clean up the dinner dishes. Urahara was probably reading in a quiet corner, since Jinta was too busy to tease her. And his dad, he was. Ichigo. His father's voice poured down the corridor, coming from an open doorway. Ichigo. Growling under his breath, Ichigo rolled his eyes and hurried. If he didn't, his dad would keep calling. I'm coming. He all but shouted back, finally sliding into the doorway. What is it? He scowled on principle alone, not appreciating the summons. His dad smiled brightly, that damn fan of his waving through the air as he reclined in his chair. His desk was covered with stacks of messy paperwork, scribbles and equations, and the occasional insane muttering. Ichigo could remember so clearly in that instant when he had awoken to this face. Shadowed by an ugly hat and chin covered in coarse whiskers, but a bright if sorrowful smile on his lips. He remembered crying with his sisters clinging to him as he lay in bed, arm unable to move because of the thick wrappings. At the time, he'd only vaguely recognized this man as Isen's friend. He'd only met Urahara once or twice, and in his fright of earlier, Ichigo had not recognized him. In fact, he hadn't even remembered until the man had reminded him. Urahara had promised to take care of them, that he would make sure they weren't alone. And despite the odds, he had. He'd taken Ichigo and his sisters into his home without asking anything in return and treated them as if they were his own. Even when Ishida-san Ryukin had protested, Urahara hadn't budged. As Shinigami woke up, his dad commented. You should go talk to her. He raked a hand over his hair as he returned his hat to its proper place. He had never explained his reason for caring about the ugly thing so much, and Ichigo hadn't asked. Though he strongly suspected it had something to do with his mother. Is it really smart to let her stay here? Ichigo questioned as he lifted one corner of the towel to wipe away a bead of water that slithered down his neck. I mean, wouldn't that be dangerous for you? The blonde shrugged in his usual casual way. She should be grateful, nah. And if I have to, we have ways of making people forget. His pale eyes gleamed with a certain mischief, and Ichigo really wasn't surprised. The teen rolled his eyes, turning back towards the hall. Why doesn't that reassure me? He asked rhetorically, even as he fought back another yawn. His hand clamped to his shoulder, squeezing the sore joint. The shower had done much to help, but it still ached. His father's laughter followed him out of the room. There was a thunk as the chair legs hit the floor once more, the blonde most likely returning to his complicated calculations. He had been working tirelessly on some big project lately. Ichigo hadn't asked because he doubted he would be able to understand even if he had. He did know, however, that it had something to do with hollows, including the one within him. Shaking his head, Ichigo continued down the hall and towards the spare room. The door was cracked open a few inches, and Ichigo paused just beyond it, hearing the woman's low voice. He couldn't make out what she was saying, nor could he feel anyone else in there with her. Slightly suspicious, he peered through the opening to find that she was sitting up in her bed. The Shinigami had one hand lifted, and balanced on her finger was a black butterfly. Wings fluttered slowly as the woman spoke to it. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, lips pulled into a frown. But seconds later, the butterfly was flitting away, its dark wings taking it to the window. It passed through the glass easily and fled into the dampness of the evening. Ichigo wondered who she had contacted. Perhaps the captain of her division. Maybe she was just reporting in. What had she said? And why wasn't his father more concerned? Urahara Kisu could be so damn nonchalant at times, it was annoying. Taking a breath, Ichigo pulled in the escaping tendrils of his, effectively masking his presence. No need to let her realize just how strong he was. With that, he lifted a hand and briefly rapped his knuckles against the wooden frame. Without waiting for a response, he slid the door open fully to catch her in the middle of startling surprise. "You're awake," Ichigo said, pausing in the doorway and leaning against the frame. Another trickle of water crept down his neck and he swiped at it with the edge of his towel with an annoyed motion. She smiled up at him, but it was thin at best. One that definitely didn't reach her eyes. The girl looked him over, something flickering over her expression before she dipped her head at him. "Ichigo-san." He waved a hand, hoping to dispense with all that annoying formality. "Yeah, that's me." Old eyes flickered over the girl, who didn't look much better than earlier. The blood was gone, but she was still frighteningly pale and fragile. Like a piece of stained glass. He hardly believed she was a Shinigami. She barely seemed older than him, though he knew looks were often deceptive with spirits. She folded her arms in her lap, eyes never leaving him. "Urahara-san said that you were the one who destroyed the hollow. I didn't realize there was another Shinigami on patrol around here." Ichigo winced internally. Obviously, his father hadn't explained anything to her. He was going to strangle the old man for foisting off the explanations. That was just like him, too. "Karakura, a big town," Ichigo replied, searching frantically for an explanation that held a lot of truth but was based on a complete lie. The Shinigami inclined her head in agreement but didn't lose sight of her initial line of questioning. "I don't recognize you, Ichigo-san. What division are you from?" Damn, she had to be one of those tenacious ones, didn't she? And here he'd gotten the impression that the other Shinigami were a hardy collection of fools and idiots. His father's words and not his. "Shouldn't you introduce yourself first?" Ichigo shifted in the doorway, frantically changing the subject once more. He wasn't good at lying believably, and it pissed him off that his dad hadn't thought to make something up. She flushed, eyes widening at what was an obvious and very impolite foible. "Kichiki Rukia of the 13th Division," the woman introduced and attempted to sit up straight, wincing when the action pulled at one of her many injuries. "This is my jurisdiction." "I know. I've seen you around," Ichigo responded before his mouth completed communication with his brain. That might not have been the best thing to say. Ichigo latched onto that mistake, however, proving once again that not all Shinigami were morons. "Damn. If you know that, then why are you here?" She peered at him again, that strange look passing through her expression once more. "Like I said, it's a big town," Ichigo returned. "And I'm not from a division. I don't work for the Gate 13, he corrected vaguely. She tipped her head to the side, as if considering his words. "I see," Kichiki responded slowly and attempted one of those small broken smiles again. "Thank you for the aid then, Ichigo-san. The hollow was much stronger than it seemed." "Ichigo," he suggested, not really wanting all that formality. "And I've noticed it myself. Karakura really attracts them." This, at least, was a topic he could feel comfortable with. Sorta. At least, it wasn't directed at who and what he was. It was just like his father to foist the dirty work on him. Everyone knew how terrible of a liar Ichigo was. "I noticed," she agreed, and her blue eyes raked over him again. In fact, she had hardly looked away from him from the moment he walked into the room. It made Ichigo just a bit uncomfortable. Or actually, really uncomfortable. His hand unconsciously lifted to his shoulder, squeezing the sore joint. and his cheeks heated under her intense stare. More so because he couldn't tell what she was looking at. The discomfort turned to annoyance, and he twitched. "Why the hell do you keep staring at me?" he demanded, perhaps a tad too harshly, but he didn't like this. He felt like a specimen on display. Ichigo's eyes widened, and he was surprised to see that she blushed to the roots of her hair, turning her fair skin a cherry tomato red. "I apologize," she stammered, delicate hands twisting the sheets around her fingers. "You look like someone I used to know." "Used to know?" Well, either the guy was missing or dead, though Ichigo suspected the latter from her reaction. He considered it, faintly recalling that she had called a name in her brief second of lucidity. "Pain, right. You said his name earlier." Uncountable sadness that seemed all too familiar to Ichigo glimmered in her eyes. This was the grief of loss. He was certain of it now. Whoever this Cain had been, he was certainly deceased now. And probably meant more than just a casual friend. A boyfriend maybe. Nakama. Ichigo nodded, releasing a slow breath. "Yes. You resemble him greatly." She paused, and the corners of her mouth twitched. "But only in appearance. Your personalities differ." Ichigo wasn't sure if he should take that as an offense or not, so he let it pass. He shrugged dismissively and raked one hand through his still damp hair, glancing around the room pointedly. "Well, you can stay here until you're healed," he redirected the conversation because it had gotten uncomfortable, and he was all for escaping. "Thank you." She tipped her head into a shallow bow, full of proper manners and the like. But she couldn't quite cover up her subsequent yawn, body no doubt needing to recover from her injuries. Still, it was strange. Ichigo had recovered from being worse himself and much faster. What he could feel of her, however, was a barely moving stream beneath the surface. Sluggishly stirring within its banks. The icy bite he had sensed earlier was missing, leaving only a chill wind behind. Whatever had happened between her and the hollow, it had zapped at her and left only remnants behind. Just what kind of creature had it been? He shifted back to the door, stepping out and hesitating with one hand left on the frame. "Get some rest," Ichigo added, and well, that was the extent of his comfort. He didn't know why his dad wanted him to talk to her. He supposed that it was to accept her gratitude face to face. Ichigo waved goodbye over his shoulder and closed the door behind him to give her some privacy. She didn't seem suspicious of anything, which was good. But he still didn't think it was a good idea to keep her so close. Their continued existence depended on Soul Society not paying too much attention to them. Ichigo's current form, for lack of a better word, was enough for the judgmental bastards to send down an assassination squad. Much less all the other stuff that was going on behind the scenes. Shinji and his gang. Yuruchi-sen's mischief. His own father's experiments. The teen wandered back towards his dad's room, a frown pulling deeper on his lips. He needed some explanations, though it was never easy to understand the man's thought processes. The scientist thrived on being mysterious, and he always had something up his sleeve. Perverted shopkeeper. But it was thought fondly. Dad was still in his messy office, tapping a pen against his chin as he stared thoughtfully at the ceiling. He was tipped back in his chair and watched the fan lazily rotate, hat missing from his head and perched on the desk instead. If it weren't for his impeccable balance, he would have already fallen. "Getting lots of work done, I see," Ichigo commented dryly, not bothering to announce himself any other way. No doubt his father had already anticipated his visit. The pen paused in its rhythm briefly as the blonde hummed low in his throat. "I'm contemplating," he responded back before dropping his seat with a heavy thunk. "And how is our guest?" "Suspicious as hell." Ichigo shot him a sour, aggravated look. "Thanks for explaining things, by the way. Made everything a lot easier for me." The sarcasm, it wounds me, Ichigo. "Don't you love me anymore?" Teasing glinted in gray eyes, and Ichigo shook his head, very used to his dad's antics. This and that are two different things. So go ahead and tell me why she has practically no dot. Sighing in defeat, Urahara took on a serious expression, lifting his eyebrow in Ichigo's direction. She drained herself fighting that hollow. It had some sort of ability to leech. I've had to place her in it temporarily. Ichigo leaned against the desk. How long is temporary? It's hard to say. His dad shifted in his chair as the wind gave a great and angry gust, rattling the windows with a harsh spray of rain. Until then, we'll just have to keep up false pretenses. The teen scowled, not liking the idea of having to fake his entire existence for an indefinite period of time. What am I supposed to do then? Keep her locked in the room? That's not suspicious at all, his dad put in dryly, obviously amused. Don't worry. Two-chan will think of something. This was said brightly. Not that it encouraged Ichigo in the slightest. He harumphed and turned out of the room, stomach reminding him that he hadn't eaten yet and it was past time that he should do so. He didn't like this one bit. He had the oddest feeling that things weren't going to be as simple as his dad believed. There was something hanging in the air, and it wasn't just the bad weather. It was almost tangible, like a charged warning. The thunder rumbling seemed to agree with him. He would have to keep a close eye on that Shinigami. Kisuke sighed and rose to his feet, frowning. The Shinigami slept soundly, and her wounds were healing very well. He supposed that was something to be relieved about. But he couldn't help the stirrings of guilt. Even if it was something he had to do. Gathering up his various utensils, Kisuke grabbed his hat off a nearby table and placed it back on his head. The girl murmured something in her sleep that he couldn't quite make out and turned over. She didn't seem distressed, so he didn't worry and quietly left, closing the door behind him. It would probably be another day or so before she would be able to move on her own. And then, things really would become complicated. A lot of lies would have to be borne. He hoped that she and his son did not become too close in the coming weeks. Whether or not Ichigo would understand about the Heijuku, Kisuke wasn't sure. It was not something he was particularly proud of, but it needed to be done. He couldn't let that bastard get his hands on it. And it wasn't just his own safety at stake. Or even the lives of his family. It was everything. Kisuke rarely regretted anything, much less his inventions. He sincerely hoped he wouldn't be given reason to regret this one. The former captain wandered back towards his lab, senses soothed by the feel of all 5 of his children present and in good health. Yuzu had received a small cut on her forehead, and Karen was bruised, but they would be fine. Kisuke wouldn't be able to face either of his now dead friends if he had let something happen to their children. They were just as precious to him, too. He placed his kit on his cluttered desk amidst other projects in progress. Kisuke dropped down into his chair, the metal squeaking beneath him. A headache threatened to stab behind his eyeballs, and he felt inexplicably tired. He sighed, reaching for the Shinigami equivalent of extra-strength aspirin. "I'm getting too old for this," he muttered to no one in particular, popping 3 of the pills and swallowing them dry. The uncoated capsules were bitter on his tongue. "If you're old, then I must be ancient." The teasing voice, appearing out of nowhere, nearly gave Kisuke a heart attack. He whirled around in his chair, causing it to spin before his feet halted the movement. There, perched on his windowsill despite the rain coming down in sheets beyond the awning, was Yuruchi. She grinned at him, golden eyes sparkling as she dripped on his floor. "Hey, Kai-chan." "Yuruchi?" he exclaimed in unexpected surprise and happiness. He leapt to his feet and grabbed for a mostly clean towel. "Get in here. You're going to get sick." She easily caught the cloth, immediately pulling it over her head as one eyebrow lifted. "Too many years as a father, Kisuke. Need I remind you who the elder sibling is here?" Yuruchi lifted a fist, lightly knocking him upside the head, though he stood a good bit taller than she. "You'll understand when you have children of your own someday, Kami save us all," he returned, reaching up to make sure his hat had not slid askew. Kisuke looked down as she continued to drip on his floor. "I still have some of your clothes in my room. Change before you really do get sick," he added with a push towards the door. Yuruchi laughed at him, willingly going along with his demands. But a life of responsibility is just not for me." She squeezed water out of her hair as she preceded him to his room at the very end of the hall. "Then, it is a good thing I'm here to make up for your lack of," Kisuke teased, tugging at the end of her damp ponytail. She winked at him. "Grow a few feet and you think you're the top of the world. I still remember when you only came up to my chin. And may that forever only be a memory." Kisuke chuckled, recalling those days as well. He would never forget the day he'd met her, discovering that he had a sister all along who he'd never known about. It had been a surprise, but a welcome one. "You don't need to be superior to me in everything. Just the things that count." Yuruchi pushed open the door and moved into his bedroom, proceeding to rifle through his closet for something warm and dry to wear. The towel was dropped to the floor as she tossed out various articles of clothing, making it appear as if his hamper had thrown up. Kisuke shook his head, watching as she selected a plain t-shirt and some loose pants, scowling at the color, but choosing them anyway. And then, he turned his back as she unashamedly stripped out of her wet clothing and dropped them with soggy plops onto the floor. Honestly, she had no shame. Yuruchi was his sister, and he had no desire to see the goods that many men in Sirte had lustily desired. It had taken him forever to break her out of the habit of wandering around in just her underwear. Poor Ichigo had suffered a week of blushing so badly that his friends thought he was sunburned. "Not that I'm complaining," he began as more articles of wet clothing were flung hither-thither in his room. He examined his fingernails patiently. "But you braved the rain just for a visit. I know how much cats hate water." Yuruchi snorted in a very inelegant fashion. She had never been very ladylike, which baffled Kisuke since he knew she had been raised better. "For my kawaii nephew, of course I would venture out of my den," she declared loudly. "Ichigo?" Kisuke guessed with a lifted brow. "Who else?" He heard the rustling of fabric before she chuckled. "You can turn around, Kai-chan." Yuruchi clucked her tongue. "Honestly, you need to get laid." It was a credit to how long he had known her that he didn't sputter gracelessly. And it was thanks to knowing her that he could easily connect her statements. I think 5 children is enough, my dear, he returned as he shifted back around, his sister managing to make a plain shirt and partially ripped pants look stunning. Really, he envied her. No one said you had to actively procreate, Yuichi countered, rolling her eyes as she snatched a towel from the floor and pulled her hair into a messy, dripping pile on top of her head. But as I was saying, I felt Ichigo's across town and decided to investigate. She paused, eyes now serious. Since when have you decided to take in Shinigami strays? Since Ichigo brought one to me, barely alive and bleeding, the blonde answered, mentally frowning. If Yuichi had sensed all that, perhaps someone else had as well, he would need to stretch out his feelers and see if anyone had noticed Ichigo. Besides, Yuzu and Karen were distraught. They asked me to help. She twisted the towel skillfully around her hair before being satisfied with it. The wet clothes were left in various clumps around his room. Kisuke sighed before resigning himself to picking up, just as he did for his children. So much for elder siblings. You as a father are too adorable for words, Yuichi teased, flopping down onto his bed and stretching out like a cat. You couldn't resist those big, shining eyes. Perhaps. But that wasn't the only reason you came, was it? Her clothing was damp and clammy, and Kisuke hurried to dump them into the laundry basket. She folded her arms behind her toweled hair. Other than the fact that nearly anyone could feel Ichigo projecting. You really have to work on that. I'm trying, he retorted with a hint of impatience, not for her reminder, but for himself. It was frustrating. Not even my training is capable of teaching him to keep his completely contained. The human body was not built to carry Shinigami abilities for an indefinite length of time. He needs Retsu-sen or Shunsui. Yuichi pursed her lips as she considered, forehead drawn tight with seriousness as her playful look shifted away. Or better yet, Jayushiro. Dropping the last bit in the hamper, Kisuke pulled his mouth into a line, sitting down tiredly on his bed. I don't think either of them will be able to do much. He can't help that he is still somewhat human. His hat fell from his head, landing beside him. Somewhat, Yuichi agreed, and there was sadness in her voice. Have you noticed then? He fell back, stretching out across the bed perpendicular to his dear sister. You mean, the fact that he's leaking, for lack of a better word, into his friends? Precisely that. Their powers are already stirring. Her hand dropped to his hair, affectionately running her fingers through it. After so many years, they had grown comfortable with each other, an interesting camaraderie of brother and sister. I know. Tessai agreed to train Sato-kun, and the boy has already been here several times. That incident with the parrot and the hollow after it had pretty much sealed the need to teach the boy something. Karen watches them occasionally. I think she wants to become a Shinigami. He fought the urge to curl his fingers into fists. His sisters adore him. Yuichi smiled fondly. It's hard not to. At least, you don't have to worry about that Quincy boy. Is Ryukin still making a nuisance of himself? Kisuke snorted, thinking sourly of the pale-haired doctor who had tried to take the Kurosaki children under his wing out of some misguided sense of duty to Isen. No doubt he would have raised them to despise Shinigami, not that Kisuke was in love with Soul Society himself, and Ryukin would not have known how to handle Ichigo. He closed his eyes and let the soothing motions of her fingers chase away the lingering migraine. He has given up. I'm more stubborn than him. At least in some things. He considered for a moment. I'm at a loss for what to do about Inoue-chan. Might you be willing to offer your services? Again, with a busty female, it had been a case of circumstances beyond his control, opening their eyes to the spiritual world. Kisuke never would have expected Inoue's brother to return as a hollow and then subsequently try to consume her. It had been a difficult experience for Ichigo, who had never had to cleanse someone he'd known before. That had been only a couple of weeks ago, not long before Sato-kun acquired the possessed parrot. Yuichi laughed. My dear, you never did learn how to handle females. I suppose that means you don't know what to do with Totsuki-chan either. Kisuke bolted upwards. Her, too. He repeated in surprise, having not realized that she was affected as well. It had always been harder for him to sense these things in women. Perhaps Yuichi was right. Golden eyes danced in amusement as Yuichi sat up, towel losing some of its tight coiling. You haven't noticed? Oh, that's too funny. She laughed, ignoring Kisuke's unamused look. I suppose I can take her under my wing, too. You've got enough on your hand with Ichigo. He didn't really need that reminder. He loved Ichigo dearly, but sometimes, even he was confused by the teen's advanced growth and strength. And he couldn't forget what he'd been forced to do to save Ichigo's life. The changes the Hijoku had made to him could never be reversed. Ichigo had never expressed anger over it, but Kisuke did wonder. And worry. What are you going to do about Kichiki-san? Kichiki? Kisuke was horrified. A noble. He had a noble Shinigami in his possession. And he'd stuffed her full of the Hijoku. Hell, exile was looking like a walk in the park compared to what the Kichiki would do to him. You didn't recognize her? I didn't know I needed to. He felt sick on the inside. But now that I think about it, damn it. There was no turning back now. Why hadn't he recognized her sooner? He knew most of the Kichiki cousins on site thanks to his time in the 2nd Division, and he'd believed Byakuya was an only child. Unless he'd had a kid when Kisuke wasn't looking. He did recall hearing that the man had gotten married. Was he missing something? Kisuke racked his brain and recalled with dawning clarity that Byakuya had not only lost his wife, but had adopted some brat from Rukongai as well. Ah, so this was she. His head started to spin just a bit. Well, she's probably grateful more than anything. So long as you don't lead her into who and what Ichigo actually is, everything should be fine, Yoruichi stated dismissively, rising to her feet with a long and languorous stretch. Her towel slipped from her head and allowed the coil of dark hair free. Perhaps, Kisuke responded faintly, wishing he hadn't screwed up that badly. To put the Hijyoku in a Kichiki. Not the smartest thing. Yoruichi tossed him a sympathetic look before flouncing towards the door, having way too much energy on her hands. Don't worry, Kai-chan. Everything will be fine. She winked and then disappeared out the doorway. Down the hall, he felt her move. And not but a few moments later, he heard Ichigo roar in annoyance and embarrassment. Ack. Yoruichi-san. Get off me. Her laugh echoed through the hallway. Kisuke could almost guarantee that she was glomping on him, squeezing his face into her bosom. It's Oba-chan. Call me Oba-chan, Ichi-kun. Like hell. He spluttered. I'm too old for that. And there was the distant sound of a crash. Kisuke hoped that they hadn't destroyed anything valuable. There was a minute of silence where Kisuke hauled himself to his feet and snatched up his hat, heading out to make sure that they really didn't break anything. Or that they didn't wake up Kichiki-san. And then, there was the laundry or dinner to start, either of which Tessai would do. No. Stop. Ichigo shouted in a fluster from the end of the hall. Put it back on. Fine, fine. Kisuke couldn't help but grin. Yoruichi always teased Ichigo like that. With her assets, nearly anyone would be bothered if she started to undress. You're making him blush, Oba-kan, Karen chided. Her bored tone was audible as Kisuke drew near the main room. He could hear her clicking through the channels on the television, likely anticipating the moment Yuzu's favorite show came on. The one with that fake spiritualist on Kananji. He's a growing boy, you know. Yoruichi laughed. But he's just so cute when he blushes like that. As Kisuke rounded the corner, stepping into the doorway, he saw his sister pressing a finger to Ichigo's cheek and nearly straddling him as he struggled to push her away. Indeed, his son was a brilliant shade of red, though whether from embarrassment or exertion Kisuke shouldn't say. Karen wasn't even looking at them. He didn't see Yuzu or Yururu, which meant they were probably helping Tessai somewhere. And no doubt Kisuke would have to fetch Jinta from the back where he was hiding from the girls and their attempts to play dress up with him. I am not, Ichigo retorted, and with a great heave, he pushed Yoruichi away from himself, springing out from under her. He didn't even cast his aunt a second look as he skirted around her sprawled form and headed for the door. I'm going to my room. He stepped by Kisuke and into the hallway. Kisuke shook his head. Teenagers, he murmured under his breath and then clucked his tongue at Yoruichi, who had taken her tumble with a Shihuan's grace. You'll learn to stop antagonizing him someday. No, she won't, Karen corrected, idly rubbing at a bruise on her arm. Ichi-nai's too easy to rile. Karen had a point. Ichigo, for all his stern appearance, was pretty sensitive for a teenager. Sometimes, it had been trickier raising him, not that Kisuke was complaining or anything. She's right, Yoruichi agreed, curling up on the floor as though she planned on taking a nap then and there, heedless of her surroundings. It's too much fun. Kisuke sighed, shaking his head at their behavior. No doubt Ichigo would spend the rest of his night shut up in his room. That was, provided he didn't sneak out for more hollow hunting. It was fruitless to try and convince him to lay low. Ichigo simply couldn't do it, not when he could feel the hollows and their hunger. Perhaps it had something to do with the one he had inside him, a sort of resonance. Kisuke wasn't sure and he was hesitant to experiment on his own son. He would simply have to wait and see. He could only hope that everything would be fine. This is your idea of thinking of something? Ichigo hissed, gesturing sharply towards the kitchen where Kichiki Ruki now was sitting with the rest of his family, calmly enjoying her breakfast. That wasn't the problem. He couldn't very well expect the Shinigami to continue taking meals in her room. And he wouldn't deny her food. The issue was that she was dressed in a female's school uniform to match the one that Ichigo currently wore. His father actually expected Ichigo to take her with him. How am I supposed to explain going to human school? Ichigo added, feeling as though he were too young to be having this stress. His agreed and attempted to lash out of his control. He thinned his lips, reining it back in. And won't the school and my friends find her appearance just a little I don't know sudden? His dad looked at him, something dancing behind his eyes. Ichigo, if you keep yelling like that all of our lives won't mean anything. Ichigo worked his jaw for several seconds and forced himself to take a deep breath. He felt his forehead tick and reminded himself that this man was his father and therefore the responsible one. And if he thought this was going to work, then it probably was. Oftentimes, his dad had the luck of the stupid. Just how do you think I'm going to explain this? Ichigo asked, and it was hissed more than spoken, as he struggled to lower a voice that wanted to yell loudly. His dad grinned. Don't worry. Kichiki-san is a smart girl. I'm sure she'll figure it out all on her own. He waved a hand of dismissal and pressed a palm to his chest. Besides, you can't very well keep her here for weeks on end. It'll be fine, Ichigo. Don't worry. He clapped his eldest, at least physically, son on the shoulder. Ichigo wasn't quite convinced. Case in point being the sight in front of him, Rukia frowning in discontent at the juice box Yuzu had handed her 5 minutes ago. She'd yet to manage to get into it and kept turning the box over and over, as if expecting it to open on its own. Right, Ichigo snorted, shaking his head. She'll fit in just fine, he tossed over his shoulder as he moved into the kitchen and grabbed both a box and a straw from the pathetic Shinigami. He really couldn't see how this was going to work, not one bit. She knew nothing about the living world. And worse, he couldn't tell her anything that would lead her to believe he was anything more than she interpreted him to be. Confusing. Sometimes, Ichigo really hated his father. Thank you, Rukia said quietly as he punched the straw into the carton and handed it back to her. I admit to having never seen such a thing before. You must have been stationed here for quite a while. How easily she blended a compliment with a well-disguised query. Kichiki was a crafty one, and Ichigo wished he knew how to handle her better. It had been hard enough explaining that she needed to take it for a while, and now forcing her to attend school with him. That was like asking for her to discover the truth. Ichigo ground his teeth and plastered a fake look of casual disregard on his face, browsing the breakfast selection for something quick and easy. Toast it was then. You'll get it eventually, he responded vaguely, leaving her to puzzle out the truth behind his so-called mission. Ichigo felt as if he trod over thin ice in flame-covered boots. Things could get ugly. Really fast. Ichinai. Karen hollered as she moved past the hallway, struggling to get into a shirt as she stumbled around in a sleep daze. Asano's outside, and he's making a big racket. Bold eyes darted to the clock, and Ichigo groaned. Damn, but they were running behind. That was what he got for threatening his father first thing in the morning. He snatched his GAKURAN1 off the back of a chair and shrugged into it. Alright, Rukia, let's go, he mumbled around a mouthful of toast, trying to remember where he left his bag. She nodded and rose to her feet, tugging self-consciously at the short length of her skirt. Ichigo wasn't even sure he wanted to know how his dad had acquired the item and was afraid to worry there was some poor girl out there missing her skirt from her clothesline. Either that or Tessai had been up all night sewing again. It wasn't an unusual occurrence. Urahara Kisuke had to get all those ugly Haori from somewhere, didn't he? Have fun storming the castle, kids, his father called after them cheerfully as Ichigo moved into the hall, grabbing his bag where it had been pushed into a messy sprawl to the side. Thank you for breakfast, Rukia was saying politely, already halfway towards a bow that they really didn't have time for. It was. Ichigo clapped a hand on her shoulder, dragging her along with him. Well, Yuzu is surely beaming right now, that's really not necessary, he grunted and urged the slow-moving female towards her own and shoes. Just beyond the door, he swore that he could hear Kigo singing, and the mere thought made him wince. The longer he made Kigo wait, the more obnoxious the boy could get. He really didn't know how Mizuru tolerated such idiocy on a daily basis. Or how Ichigo had been tolerating it for years. School must be important to humans, Rukia muttered to herself, sliding into her shoes with a small amount of effort. Her mouth had drawn into a petite circle of annoyance, but she restrained herself. Ichigo had the feeling that restraint wasn't something she applied often. At least, not when it came to expressing her irritation. He wondered how long her polite distance would last when faced with the chaos that was high school and living at the Urahara household. Not long, he estimated. He pretended he hadn't heard her offhand comment and opened the door, stepping into a somewhat humid morning. Mizuru stood by the fence, leaning casually on it as he chomped on his breakfast and other cereal bar. And Kigo was in the middle of some strange dance that Ichigo didn't even want to fathom the purpose behind. His Ichigo instincts kicked into action then, and Kigo immediately zeroed in on his childhood friend, crossing the ground with an elaborate twirl. The Ichiguo, he sing-songy, looking far too happy for it to be this early. How are you, dear Kami in heaven? A lovely lady. Behind Ichigo, Rukia had just stepped out and watched Kigo with a small amount of apprehension. For the first time, Ichigo appreciated her intelligence. Any female was wise to fear Kigo. Who is this vision of stunning beauty? Kigo continued, holding out a hand to take Rukia's. She wisely didn't return the gesture, gaze warily flicking over the exuberant teenager. Ichiki Rukia, Ichigo explained shortly, hefting his bag over his shoulder as he started down the walk, the Shinigami following after him. Perhaps a bit closer than was necessary as she kept Kigo in her sights. She watched Ichigo, too. Those blue eyes always assessing, no doubt wishing she could ask the questions that lingered in the back of her mind. Ichigo dearly hoped that she never got the chance. For once in his life, he was glad for Kigo's obnoxiousness as it kept her occupied and not asking questions. "Nice to meet you, Kichiki-san," Mizuru greeted with a polite tip of his head, falling into line beside Ichigo and giving her a small smile. She beamed brightly in return, almost surprising Ichigo with her sudden shift from calculating to bubbly. "Kojima-san, right." Rukia returned, clutching her school bag with both hands. "Ichigo's told me about you." Wow, she lied even better than his father. Ichigo hadn't mentioned any of his friends. No doubt someone had given her a few pointers. Probably Yuzu or Karen, they were better at this stuff than him. "Has he said anything about me?" Kigo inserted brightly, popping up in front of them and pointing a finger towards himself, as if there were any doubt who he meant. "Anything at all?" he urged, giving off the impression of a puppy wagging its tail. Rukia appeared to consider this, a devilish sparkle entering her blue eyes. "No. Not a thing, I'm afraid." "Who are you again?" She looked so concerned, so interested that it was difficult to tell she was lying. As Kigo deflated like a balloon that had lost its helium, Ichigo couldn't resist a tiny smirk. He should be ashamed of himself, but really, the other team made it so easy. "Ichigo," Mizuru inserted as Kigo frowned and introduced himself with a grand flourish, again trying to take Rukia's hand. "Who is she?" He momentarily faltered, a great lie escaping him. "A relative. On my dad's side," he suggested, though it was so obviously not true. Mizuru raised a brow, suspicious but not questioning him. Ichigo wouldn't have reason to lie, after all. Even if it remained apparent that Rukia resembled no one from his family, and especially not the Kurosaki side. Not that he'd known Ichigo's mother all that well. But he still remembered what she had looked like. With Kigo serving as a sufficient distraction, they made it to the school without Ichigo having to suffer any probing questions. Even more luckily, his dad had already contacted the officials about Rukia's appearance, and her papers and locker were ready for her when they arrived. She had unsurprisingly been placed in Ichigo's class, making things nice and simple. Or complicated. Depending on how one wanted to look at it. Ichigo pushed Rukia ahead of him into the classroom, surrendering her to the masses. He allowed the girls to swamp her, offering their greetings and compliments, as the boys immediately made plots to introduce themselves in a more suave and personal fashion later. That would at least keep the Shinigami from paying too much attention to Ichigo's actions. He tossed a glance from the corner of his eyes as he headed towards his desk and found Rukia blushing demurely. The smile on her face was pleasant, and only he could tell it was fake. Damn, she was good. Nothing to be worried about then, not that Ichigo would admit that his dad was right. Things still had the capacity to go to hell in a handbasket. Ishida looked at him as he approached his seat, one hand pushing his glasses up his nose pointedly until they caught the gleam of the overhead light. "Bad enough that I have to suffer you, but now sirite trash." He muttered in annoyance and flicked a bespectacled gaze towards Kichiki before returning it to Ichigo. He dropped into his seat with a grunt, glossing over Ishida's less than savory comments. "Long story. Don't ask. And I don't think I need to tell you to be discreet. She has no clue what's really going on." "Awful big word for you," Ishida sniffed, all indignant, arching one brow as he seemed so fond of doing. "Unlike a certain someone, I have enough intelligence to know when to speak and when to keep my mouth sealed." Ichigo scowled, brow drawing together as his face darkened. "Look, Ichigo." Itsuki interrupted, and he dismissed Ishida to focus on another of his childhood friends. "Yeah?" Ichigo turned to greet her. Only to frown at her expression. "What's that for?" "A relative," Totsuki pressed, obviously not as accepting as Mizuru had been. "And how is it that I've never heard of her?" Her palms flattened against his desk, eyes stubborn and determined. Ichigo quailed just a bit. His Shinigami abilities notwithstanding, Totsuki was easily capable of kicking his ass if the situation suited her. She was the strongest female he knew, except for possibly Uruchi-san. Still, that was really saying something. Ichigo's eyes flickered to Rukia, who had been swamped and promptly glomped by Chizuru, her fake politeness reaching a threshold. "I couldn't explain it even if I tried," Ichigo finally answered. He wouldn't even know where to begin in the madness that had become his life. The spirit worlds. Hollows. Shinigami. All of it. How could he even begin to explain it? Myth, legend, fable, fantasy, that was public opinion. He couldn't explain Rukia without explaining the rest, and that would take longer than he had. "Just trust me," Ichigo added as he held her gaze firmly. "It's complicated." Itsuki frowned, face unwavering. "You know," she began softly, shoulders squared and resolute. "I've always gotten the feeling that you're hiding something." Ichigo fidgeted, not wanting to have this conversation here and now. He glanced at the clock. Homeroom would start in 5 minutes. Not soon enough. Tatsuki. Kurosaki-kun. Inoue chirped, bounding up out of nowhere and displaying incredible timing as she bounced to a stop in front of him, clapping her hands together. Your cousin came to visit. Aren't you excited? Ichigo inches away from the exuberant girl. It was too early for Perky. Sure, Inoue. Thrilled, he drawled as she beamed at him, gray eyes sparkling. The girl pouted, obviously not satisfied with his lackluster response. Ah, you should be smiling. See? She put her fingers to the corners of her mouth and drew them into a wide grin for his benefit. Family is important, you know, she added around her fingertips, looking quite comical. He would have protested sourly, but Ichigo remembered that Inoue was a lot like himself. Her brother was gone, leaving her on her own. And yet, she still managed to be the optimistic ray of sunshine. Yeah, I know, Ichigo agreed and was very relieved when he saw Chad approaching from the other side, distracting him from the conversation. Inoue moved her attention to Tatsuki then, further serving to deflect her from questioning Ichigo, and he bit back a sigh of relief. He had dodged something there, though he wasn't quite sure what. Tatsuki had become more and more demanding lately, relentlessly seeking information. He wondered how long he would be able to hold out before she would wrangle the truth out of him. The bell rang, cutting Chad off before he could speak, if he even intended to do so. And as Achi-sensei clapped her hands for order and rushed the students to their seats, Ichigo shared a glance with his friend. There was understanding on Chad's face, and Ichigo knew without having to ask that somehow, Chad knew Rukia wasn't his cousin or any familial relation. But Chad didn't question either, and for that, Ichigo was grateful. Achi-sensei ushered Rukia to a seat just behind Ichigo, and she passed between he and Ishida, her eyes darting from one to the other, before brightening in sudden understanding. Clearly, she had just come to her own sort of conclusion, not that Ichigo would ask her to elaborate. He'd rather the Shinigami just make up her own story, rather than him trying to lie and keep it all straight. And then, homeroom started, and Ichigo was saved from making conversation or offering any sort of explanation. His classmates accepted the utter lie that Rukia was his cousin easily and latched onto her with all the eagerness of children and something new. They, at least, kept her occupied from watching Ichigo too closely. Instead, she seemed to study them with equal focus, asking pointed but subtle questions, and seeming to store it all away in some inner encyclopedia. At one point, Ichigo swore he caught her stalking Chizuru, and for reasons that he didn't even want to comprehend. No girl in her right mind ventured that near to Chizuru. Or Kigo for that matter. The duo were two perverted peas in a pod. Her behavior was odd enough that Ichigo forced himself to ask her about it. Though he waited until they were walking home from school without their usual Kigo and Mizuru accompaniment. What were you trying to do? He demanded, feeling a ticking in his forehead that was likely a headache beginning to form. She blinked up at him, as though surprised by the question. Helping, Rukia answered succinctly, one hand rooting around in her pockets for something of great importance. Obviously, your mission is too large for you to handle alone. Ichigo, for his part, was just a bit speechless. What had she decided in that dainty little head of hers was his mission? And he was half afraid to ask because then it would lead to other questions he didn't have answers for. Instead, he snorted and shifted his bag against his bag. Well, don't, he retorted lamely. I'm doing fine on my own. I don't need any extra hands. Suit yourself. She shrugged, and then the both of them were suitably distracted by the sound and feel of a hollow in the distance. Hungry and hunting. Wonderful. Since Ichigo really felt an urge to slash something down. Weeks passed, and Ichigo found himself growing used to her presence. He really had no choice about the matter. Rukia wasn't recovering as quickly as any of them would have liked, and her persistence in discovering the details behind his so-called mission was unrivaled. Ichigo wasn't sure how he managed to keep evading her, but he knew he would run out of excuses soon enough. In the meantime, he occupied her by helping her with her neglected Shinigami duties. She couldn't hunt hollows in her current state, so he responded to each appearance in her place. Ichigo quickly learned to hate her cell phone, as he realized it doubled as her communication device with Sirite. Hollow locations were beamed down to her on a daily basis, and often hourly. Sometimes, she dragged him out of school for it. One such incident sparked an annoying turn of events that resulted in the Urahara household taking on another boarder. A mod soul who Ichigo named Khan and subsequently stuffed into a plush animal. It wasn't like they had bodies just lying around for him to use anyway, though his father had claimed he was going to make one. In the meantime, both Rukia and the blonde shopkeeper preferred Ibaro Khan rather than use the flighty temporary souls in his Gakongan. Still, Ichigo's reputation would never quite be the same again. Not after the embarrassing and idiotic things Khan had done in his body. The girls kept giving him strange looks, blushing when he caught them staring and giving him a wide berth. Kigo wouldn't talk to him for days, no big loss there. All because Ichigo had stolen a kiss. And it wasn't even him. A week later Ichigo was still pissed about that. At least, up until June rolled around. It was a truth he hadn't revealed to Rukia and one that he was certain bothered her immensely. Even more than the facts behind his assumed mission. The relationship between he and Urahara and his sisters and all the other residents of the dot complicated and confusing, no doubt. June brought the truth to the forefront because try as he might Ichigo never could forget the past. Not when the anniversary came about every year, reminding him of what a hollow had callously stolen from him. His mother. Isen. His humanity. His sister's peace of mind. He didn't despise Urahara Kisuke for saving him. And he was grateful that the Jetabashi had taken Ichigo and his sisters under his wing. Still, every year Ichigo remembered. And every year, he grieved. Why are we here? Rukia asked, trailing along after him as they climbed the high slope, sun beating down on the back of their necks. Ichigo wasn't sure how to answer that without revealing too much. And he didn't really want to talk about it anyway. He certainly didn't want her to know anything. He focused his gaze on his sisters, walking a little ahead of them but not too far. He still didn't trust that a hollow wouldn't appear out of nowhere to try and eat them. Wait here, he said instead, drawing to a halt and pausing at the entrance to the memorial grounds. And then belatedly added a please when he saw that she was about to protest. Rukia stared at him, eyes searching and evaluating, before she set her chin and nodded. Fine. She moved to lean against the side of the gate as she pulled out her cell, tapping away. He was ridiculously grateful for the privacy, but Ichigo didn't say that aloud. He just inclined his head and stepped by her, following his sisters to a familiar place on the grounds. Every year for 5 years they'd come here, and this year made 6. He was sure that next year would make 7. Remembering what had been stolen from them. Parents stood, solemn and gathered as she stared at the stone etched with their parents' names. Her eyes were dark with grief but dry. Determined to be strong as she had vowed. Yuzu openly wept as she did every year. Scrubbing the back of her hand over her eyes as she crouched in front of the combined graves. The sun attempted to make things warm and pleasant, but with the echo of grief and loss that hung over them, it faced a losing battle. Ichigo squeezed his sister's shoulders briefly, letting them know he was there. It hurt, even 6 years later. He could still remember the smell of blood, the feel and sound of the rain, the sharp flash of Zanpakuto against Hollow Claw. The grating chuckle and the hollow's words. And he could never forget the blame. The guilt he carried was heavy enough, but he saved most of the fault for Isen. Ichigo had never understood the creatures he saw or the frightening cries he heard, the feelings that shifted in the air. And he'd been too young then to know the difference between the dead and the living, especially when no one had stopped to explain. If Isen had said something back then, anything that a small child could understand, things would have been different. If Isen had just sucked it up and told the truth. If he'd not been such a coward, Ichigo would have known what that feeling in his gut was. That press of something in the air. He wouldn't have gone after that girl. His mother wouldn't have died. So many ifs. Perrin sighed and lowered herself down, putting a hand on her twin's back. Hey, she said softly. You cry every year, Yuzu. Don't you think she would rather see you smile? Yeah, Yuzu murmured, sniffling as she scrubbed her hand over her face again. But it's harder to do that when I'm standing right here in front of them. Ichigo unconsciously drew a hand into a fist. They'd never blamed him, Ichigo knew that. They didn't blame Isen either. They preferred to save their anger for the hollow, and it had already been cleansed. Yuzu, their resident optimist, preferred to look to the future while remembering the past with fondness. And Karen was ridiculously good at hiding the breadth of her emotions. But Ichigo couldn't forget the past. Forget the look on his mother's face, frozen forever in time. He couldn't just forget that she had died to protect him. Killed by a creature she couldn't even see or hear. And a part of him still wondered if she had even realized what she was doing. If she had even known that she would sacrifice her very soul to save him. If Isen had even told her. Something. Anything. Even a hint of what he was. If she had been deceived like the rest of them. And that was probably the thing that angered him the most. Ichinai? A light and quiet voice questioned, effectively cutting through the haze of his thoughts. I'm fine, Yuzu, he replied automatically, uncurling his hands and forcing them not to be fists. Ichigo cleared his throat then. Dad's waiting for you at the bottom. Don't dawdle. He urged them towards the exit, wanting to be alone for reasons he couldn't explain. Perrin rolled her eyes. Should I start calling you Tusan rather than Nai-sen then? She asked teasingly, obviously picking up on his unvoiced signals and locking her arms with Yuzu. But, the younger girl protested with a wrinkled forehead. Are you okay, Ichinai? She blinked up at him, big brown eyes worried. He nearly gave in at her concern. Those eyes were dangerous weapons. I'm really fine, Ichigo assured her and even managed a smile. I just want a moment. Come on, Karen insisted, giving Yuzu a light tug. Let Ichinai grieve on his own a bit. You know how teenage boys are. Yuzu was the more empathic of the twins, but sometimes, Karen seemed to understand Ichigo better. Perhaps it was because they were too much alike. Reluctantly, Yuzu allowed her sister to pull her away, and Ichigo was grateful for it. He did need a moment alone. He didn't know what he would say. Ichigo never did. He simply stood and stared at the numbers etched into stone, the recently cleaned memorial. The memories hadn't faded, even after the years, though he wished they would. "You're here to watch the humans, aren't you?" Ichigo startled at the sound of Rukia's voice and whirled, finding the petite Shinigami right behind him. "You?" He was at a loss for words. Hadn't he asked her to wait? Did she have no concept of polite distance? She shrugged, flipping her phone shut with a defiant snap and sliding it into the pocket of her sundress, one borrowed from Yuzu. "I was tired of waiting," Rukia said dismissively, peering up at him from beneath the rim of her equally borrowed hat. "You didn't answer my question." He slouched, regarding her cautiously. How long had she been standing there? It was more like a statement. Rukia rolled her eyes. "And Quincy, I can assume," she continued but then frowned, obviously stumbling on something else in her thought processes. "Your friends they have stirrings of, but it's only partially their own. Highly unusual. I'm not sure what it is." She was stumbling closer to the truth, and it made Ichigo uneasy. He settled for avoiding the pointed question altogether. "As you've said before, Karakura has an unusual amount of spirit energy," he dismissed with a wave. "True." Rukia seemed to accept that answer, though it was clear she hadn't completely let go of her curiosity. Unwilling to dwell, Ichigo turned away from the grave and shoved his hands in his pockets. He really wanted nothing more than to go home at this point. "I get that's your mission," Rukia continued, falling into line beside him with her face drawn in contemplation. "You've made it obvious enough, but I wonder whose orders you follow." Always pressing for information. Damn, but she was tenacious. Ichigo winced, but figured that he was in this deep, might as well keep making up shit as far as it would take him. With any luck, she would be healed and on her way to Soul Society before she could figure out the absolute truth. "I can't say," he said. And it was the truth, but for a different reason than she might suspect. She nodded, gazing at him for a moment before asking the oddest question. "Are you a Shiba?" Ichigo blinked. "Excuse me?" That one had come right out of left field. "Your family name," she clarified with a vaguely hopeful tone that somehow also managed to contain dread. "Is it Shiba? I mean, I know what they call you at the human school." "No, it's really Kurosaki," Ichigo replied slowly, wondering if this was some sort of test. Rukia seemed to consider that. "Are you related to them then? I can see a resemblance." Ichigo hesitated. He knew vaguely about a Shiba clan and Soul Society, but he'd never met them before. For all he knew, that could have been Issen's family. He didn't really know much about his biological dad. Other than the fact that he was a former captain. And a liar. A big one at that. The thought made him scowl. Maybe." He gave an indifferent shrug. "I don't really know much about my parents. They were killed when I was young and I was raised by a family friend." Which was all strictly true. "Nothing at all?" She questioned with interest, studying him like one would a particularly fascinating bug. "We didn't talk about them much," he deflected. "Still don't." Again, true. Though he suspected that his dad and Yoruchi-san would be more than happy to tell him if he asked. He just never asked. Ichigo honestly didn't want to know. Rukia was incredulous. "But surely, you must know. They were one of the great families. Your mother could have been a cousin. Or a daughter. Perhaps your father." Ichigo's hand tightened into a fist. He'd already thought about Isen once today, and that was more than enough. And perhaps it was a mixture of that, of the fact that this was the anniversary of his mother's death and that he was to blame for it, but Ichigo lost his temper. "My birth father was an unmitigated bastard and a liar. I wouldn't have trusted anything he told me, so it doesn't matter if he did," the teen snapped, voice perilously close to a snarl. Already, he could feel something stir inside him. Something dark and dangerous. But then, Isen always brought out the worst in him. She looked at him with wide eyes, and Ichigo shoved his gaze away, hating that he'd lost himself for an even minute. Rukia couldn't have known that Isen was a sore spot for him. Ichigo preferred not to talk about the man if he could help it. Preferred not to think about him at all. "I'm sorry," he said after several moments. "You didn't deserve that." Rukia just nodded. "I can understand when family is a touchy subject," she responded, face distant. She was on the verge of saying more, but Ichigo chose that second to appear and flap in their general direction. Ichigo lifted an eyebrow as the dark-winged butterfly swept closer and landed on Rukia's finger, relaying a message that only she could hear. He still wondered just how much contact she had been making with Soul Society. He knew of the phone, but that was the usual. Was she also sending messages to her captain? About him? About Urahara and his family? Perhaps they hadn't been watching her closely enough. Maybe it was already too late. Rukia inclined her head, her mouth forming a thin line. The butterfly alighted, fluttering into the sky, and she dropped her hand back to her side. Her forehead formed lines of thought and Ichigo was half afraid to ask. She didn't offer any explanation either. Ichigo had the feeling both of them were relieved when her cell beeped a few seconds later, alerting them to the presence of two hollows somewhat nearby. "Duty calls," Ichigo muttered, rooting around for his dot. The Shinigami's hand was already busy searching through the small bag she usually kept across her back. In a few seconds, Khan was being shoved under his nose, the stuffed plush wiggling its limbs in protest. "Ah, Ni-san, I don't want to help him," he declared sulkily, and though Ichigo wouldn't have ever believed it possible before, the stuffed creature glared. That feeling, ironically, was mutual. Too bad she wasn't giving either of them a choice. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the DRACOQUEEN22 for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.